In the remote mountains of Tibet, a child was born to a family of nomadic herders. His parents knew from the moment they laid eyes on him that he was special. He had been born with the unmistakable signs of a high-ranking Rinpoche, a reincarnated spiritual leader. As the child grew, it became clear that he was destined for greatness. He showed an innate understanding of spiritual teachings and was able to meditate for hours on end. He was also able to perform miracles, healing the sick and bringing rain to parched lands. Despite his spiritual abilities, the child had a strong warrior spirit. He was fascinated by the stories of the Khamba warriors, the fierce fighters who had once protected Tibet from invaders. He knew that he was meant to be a leader, but he didn't know if it would be as a Rinpoche or as a warrior. As he grew older, the child began to feel a pull towards a different path. He saw the suffering of his people at the hands of foreign invaders and knew that he had to do something to help them. He began to study the ways of the Khamba warriors and soon became one of their most skilled fighters. With his spiritual powers and warrior training, the child was ready to lead his people to freedom. He would become known as the reincarnated warrior, a leader who could bring both spiritual guidance and military prowess to the struggle for Tibetan independence. The reincarnated warrior, now a young man, was determined to free his people from the oppression of foreign invaders. He knew that the traditional spiritual path of a Rinpoche was not enough to achieve this goal. He needed to find a new way, a way that combined his spiritual abilities with his warrior training. He began to travel throughout Tibet, meeting with other leaders of the resistance. He listened to their stories and learned about their struggles. He also met with foreign officials and diplomats, trying to understand the motivations and tactics of the invaders. As he traveled, the reincarnated warrior began to see a pattern. He realized that the invaders were not motivated by greed or malice, but by a lack of understanding. They saw Tibet as a backward and primitive place, and they believed that they were doing the Tibetans a favor by introducing them to civilization. The reincarnated warrior knew that the key to freeing Tibet was to change this perception. He needed to show the world that Tibet was a proud and ancient culture, with its own rich traditions and spiritual practices. He also needed to show that the Tibetans were a strong and resilient people, capable of defending themselves against invaders. With this realization, the reincarnated warrior began to develop a new strategy. He would use his spiritual powers to inspire and unite the Tibetan people, and he would use his warrior training to lead them in a nonviolent resistance against the invaders. He would show the world that Tibet was not a backward and primitive place, but a proud and ancient culture. He would be the leader that would bring a new path towards independence. With his new strategy in place, the reincarnated warrior set out to unite the Tibetan people and build a powerful resistance movement. He began by rallying the Khamba warriors, the fierce fighters who had once protected Tibet from invaders. He knew that their skills and training would be vital in the struggle for independence. The Khamba warriors were initially skeptical of the reincarnated warrior. They had long ago given up hope of freeing Tibet and had resigned themselves to a life of poverty and oppression. But the reincarnated warrior's charisma and spiritual powers were hard to ignore. He convinced them that they could make a difference, that they could free their people from the invaders. Slowly but surely, the Khamba warriors began to join the reincarnated warrior's cause. They saw in him a leader who could bring both spiritual guidance and military prowess to the struggle. They were eager to fight once more for the freedom of their people. As the number of Khamba warriors grew, the reincarnated warrior began to train them in his new strategy of nonviolent resistance. He taught them how to use their warrior skills to disrupt the invaders' operations and to protect their people without resorting to violence. He also taught them how to use their spiritual powers to inspire and uplift the Tibetan people. The Khamba warriors quickly became the backbone of the resistance movement. They were respected and feared by the invaders, who saw them as a powerful and determined force. The people of Tibet also began to see the Khamba warriors as their protectors, and they rallied around the reincarnated warrior's cause. The rise of the Khamba warriors marked a turning point in the struggle for Tibetan independence. They were the vanguard of the resistance, and they would be the ones to lead their people to freedom. With the Khamba warriors at his side, the reincarnated warrior launched his campaign for Tibetan independence. It was a long and difficult struggle, as the invaders had superior weapons and resources. But the Khamba warriors were a formidable force, and they were able to disrupt the invaders' operations and protect their people. The reincarnated warrior also used his spiritual powers to inspire and uplift the Tibetan people. He led them in peaceful protests and demonstrations, showing the world that they were a proud and ancient culture that deserved to be free. He also used his powers to heal the sick and to bring rain to parched lands, showing the invaders that they could not defeat the Tibetan spirit. As the struggle continued, the reincarnated warrior began to gain the support of the international community. He traveled to other countries and spoke at the United Nations, highlighting the plight of the Tibetan people and exposing the human rights abuses of the invaders. The invaders, who had seen Tibet as a backward and primitive place, began to realize that they were facing a powerful and determined resistance. They knew that they could not defeat the Tibetan people and decided to negotiate for peace and independence. After years of struggle, the battle for independence was won. The invaders withdrew from Tibet and the Tibetan people finally achieved the freedom that they had long been denied. The reincarnated warrior had led his people to victory, using both spiritual guidance and military prowess to achieve this. The battle for independence was over, but the legacy of the reincarnated warrior and the Khamba warriors would live on. They had shown the world that a small and oppressed people could achieve freedom through determination and spirit. The victory for independence came at a great cost for the Tibetan people. Many lost their lives in the struggle, and many more were injured or displaced. The country was left in ruins, with infrastructure destroyed and the economy in shambles. The reincarnated warrior and the Khamba warriors, who had once been united in the fight for freedom, now had to come to terms with the sacrifices they had made. They were plagued by feelings of guilt and loss, and struggled to come to terms with the price of freedom. As the leader of the resistance, the reincarnated warrior felt a great weight of responsibility. He had led his people to victory, but at what cost? He knew that he had to help his people to heal and to rebuild. He traveled throughout Tibet, meeting with the survivors and offering them spiritual guidance and support. He also began working to rebuild the country's infrastructure and to create jobs and educational opportunities for the people. He knew that a sustainable and stable society was necessary to keep the freedom they had achieved. The Khamba warriors also had to come to terms with the price of freedom. Many had lost friends and family in the struggle, and they were haunted by the memories of the violence they had witnessed. They too, like the reincarnated warrior, felt a great weight of responsibility. They turned to their spiritual practices to find solace and began to help the people to heal. They too, like the reincarnated warrior, began to rebuild the country's infrastructure and create jobs and educational opportunities. Together they were determined to help their people to heal and to rebuild, and to ensure that the freedom they had achieved would be sustainable. The price of freedom had been high, but the Tibetan people had paid it. Now they had to move forward, to heal and rebuild, and to ensure that the freedom they had won would be sustainable. The reincarnated warrior had achieved his goal of leading his people to freedom, but his work was not yet done. He knew that the legacy of his struggle would live on long after he was gone, and he wanted to ensure that it would be remembered and honored. He began to write his memoirs, documenting his journey from Rinpoche to warrior and the struggles he had faced along the way. He also began to establish schools, monasteries, and cultural centers to keep the Tibetan culture and spiritual practices alive. The Khamba warriors also continued to play an important role in preserving the legacy of the resistance movement. They trained new generations of warriors and helped to establish a strong and sustainable society. The reincarnated warrior's legacy lived on not only in the minds of the people but also in the institutions he had built. He was remembered as a spiritual leader who had led his people to freedom through a combination of spiritual guidance and military prowess. As the years passed, the reincarnated warrior passed away, but his legacy lived on. His people continued to thrive and preserve their culture, and the world recognized Tibet as a free and independent nation. The story of the reincarnated warrior, a Rinpoche who became a warrior, would be told for generations to come as an inspiration for those who fight for freedom and justice.